Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining Interface 5. Today's topic is neurocognitive correlates of task-based production, exploring pausing behaviors in second language speaking and writing. I am Vahid Aryadoust from the National Institute of Education of Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I'm hosting Interface 5, and we have two wonderful guests today, Professor Andrea Révész and Professor Hyeonjeong Jeong. I'm going to introduce them and then I'll pass the time over to them for their presentation. I'll start by introducing them first. Professor Andrea Révész is a professor of second language acquisition and the co-director of the Center for Applied Linguistics at the Institute of Education, or IOE, at University College London, or UCL. Her research interests lie at the intersections of second language acquisition, instruction, and assessment. Within these areas, her research investigates the neurocognitive processes underlying second language development and use, how these processes and their associated outcomes are shaped by factors such as task design, interaction, and individual differences. She was the winner of the 2017 TBLT Best Research Article Award and also the recipient of the 2018 TESOL Award for Distinguished Research. She serves as the editor of the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics and the co-editor of the John Benjamin's Task-Based Language Teaching series. She's the past president of the International Association for Task-Based Language Teaching, or TBLT. Just a personal note as well, we have recently had the pleasure to contribute a paper to the special issue of the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics that Professor Andrea Révész has co-edited, edited, and this special issue is about generative artificial intelligence. I'll make sure to leave the link in the comment box, or the chat box. If you're interested to browse through it, please go ahead and do so. And our second presenter today is Professor Hyeonjeong Jeong, who is a professor at the Graduate School of International Cultural Studies at Tohoku University, Japan. She is also affiliated with the Department of Human Brain Science at the Institute of Development, Aging, and Cancer at Tohoku University. Her research primarily focuses on the brain mechanisms involved in language processing and second language acquisition, utilizing a cognitive neuroscience approach. More specifically, she explores the influence of context, nonverbal factors, and social interaction on language learning, and her work has been published in leading journals in the fields such as human brain mapping, bilingualism, language and cognition, language learning, brain and language, and neuroimage. And she serves as a member of the editorial board of Brain and Language. Today's talk, as I mentioned, is about neurocognitive correlates of task-based production, exploring pausing behaviors in second language production, which is speaking and writing. Without any further ado, I would like to pass the session over to Professors Révész and Jeong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vahid, for this super generous introduction. And good morning from me, and good afternoon to all of you there. Probably most of you are in Singapore. I'll be doing most of the talking in the beginning, but then Hyeonjeong is going to take over for a little while, and she'll be answering all of your difficult questions about cognitive neuroscience. Just to say, we don't usually present together, so I'm really happy to have her here because now she can answer all the questions I normally can't. Okay, so Vahid already mentioned that the topic of our talk for today is speaking and written production, and be focusing on pausing behaviors. And as you can see, it's not just the two of us, but we've got a long list of contributors here, collaborators, and it's really important to acknowledge these, especially two of these colleagues, Motoaki Sugiura, who is the leader of the fMRI lab at Tohoku University, who provided a lot of critical insights on our research, and also my colleague, Kazuya Saito, who, among other things, I'm super grateful to, because he was the one who introduced me to Hyeonjeong and this amazing group of neuroscientists at Tohoku University. So why this topic? Why did we get interested in neurocognitive processes in second language production? Again, we'll be speaking about both speaking and writing. We've got a practical rationale and also a research rationale. Let me start with the practical rationale. Our common interface to begin with was disaster communication. We were interested in identifying effective ways to communicate in international emergency situations. The reason why disaster communication as a focus came about, because our universities have an institutional partnership, and as part of that, we were looking for interfaces, what we could focus on, what topic might be of interest to us both. So what do we know about this area? According to the Sendai framework, where Hyeonjeong University is based, it's really important to invest in, maintain, and develop emergency communication mechanisms. And of course, when it comes to international situations, this also involves communication in multiple languages. Also, according to a recommendation from the World Health Organization, if we would like to be able to communicate in emergency situations, it's really important to prepare for these emergencies for simulation in real-life setting, where the environment is high stress and rapidly evolving. Again, if it comes to international situations where people from different backgrounds and different L1 backgrounds involved, this sort of emergency situations also involve simulating communication in second or foreign languages. In crisis situations, decision-making is often crucial. So our ongoing aim in this project, again from a practical perspective, has been to investigate the neurocognitive mechanisms which are involved in decision-making in crisis situations when speakers use or writers use a second language. In the earliest stages of our research, we focused on oral decision-making tasks, and more recently, we switched to a focus on written decision-making tasks, and hopefully in the future, be able to bring these two strands together. So what about our research rationale? We are also interested in investigating the neurocognitive processes involved in spontaneous second language spoken and written production. What is new about our research is that we focus on spontaneous production. According to Hyeonjeong, when it comes to neuroscience research, very little has been done on spontaneous to-spoken production. And when it comes to writing, we might be among the first, if not the first, to look at spontaneous written production from a neurocognitive perspective. But what do we do when we speak or when we write? When it comes to speaking, I'll be describing a model that was put forward originally by Liefeld. This is a first language production model, which was applied to second language production by Judith Kormos. So when we speak, first we need to decide what we would like to say. This stage is referred to as conceptualization. Once we know what we would like to say, then we translate or formulate that message into language form. And this is the point when we engage in lexicogrammatical, morphophonological, and phonetic encoding processes. Once we've done that, we have something referred to as a pre-verbal or more of an internal speech. And then once we have this internal speech, the next stage is we want to articulate that message. So this is what the point when we pronounce, what we blend, and then we formulate it. While we engage in these processes, we constantly monitor our production. We might decide that we would like to say something else. We might also decide we would like to correct the grammar or the vocabulary or even the pronunciation of what we've uttered. All of these processes happen in parallel. This is an interactive model. So while we're conceptualizing, we're thinking about what to say. At the same time, we are engaging in linguistic encoding processes as well. Moving on to writing, you'll get to see this is a quite similar model. The model I'll be describing was put forward by Kellogg. Again, when we write, first we plan what we would like to write, we conceptualize, we use a different term here, but it's basically the same type of stage. Then in the next stage, what we need to do, we need to translate what we planned. This is a pre-verbal message at that point into linguistic form. And then we go through so-called translation processes. Translation here does not mean, here in this context, from translating from one language to another. This is just a term to refer to linguistic encoding processes. When it comes to writing, this involves lexical retrieval, looking for the correct vocabulary, syntactic encoding, and we're also thinking of cohesive devices to make sure that our written piece is coherent. Once we are done with translation, then we have a message that's planned, but it's not executed yet. In the next stage, when it comes to execution, we either type or handwrite our message. And again, just as in speaking, we constantly monitor our written production. We might decide that we would like to write something else. We might change the vocabulary. We've either written or not. This could also happen internally, or we might even change our spelling and so on. So again, this is an interactive model. All of these stages are happening in parallel. But these are models, these are theoretical assumptions. But if you would like to prove that these models are actually valid and reflect actual cognitive processes, it's also important to investigate them. So how can we investigate second language production processes? There are a number of subjective and objective methods we can use when it comes to speaking or writing. Subjective methods include questionnaires, interviews, verbal protocols, such as the stimulated recall or think aloud procedure. And recently, when it comes to some parts of SLA research, time estimation has also been used as a methodology. Among objective methods, we have duotask methodology, eye tracking, and keystroke logging. In my own research, when it comes to speaking, we've combined these methods: stimulated recalls, time estimation, questionnaires, dual-task methodology, and eye tracking. Not all of these in one study, I wish, maybe sometime in the future. And when it comes to writing, we also have keystroke logging that comes into the mix. And we actually do have studies where we use all of these sources together to get a fuller and more valid picture of the writing process. Why do we want to triangulate sources if we just have one method? We have one source of evidence, but as you get to see by the end of this talk, then we might not get the full picture of what's going on, the cognitive and neurocognitive processes our participants engage in. So this triangulation allows for a more comprehensive and more valid capture of cognitive processes. And the focus of this talk is going to be on neuroimaging. This is a method that we've just started using. And again, I'm super grateful to Hyeonjeong and her team for collaborating with us at looking at speech production and written production processes. So the first study we're going to describe is on oral production. It's recently been published in SSLA. We looked at oral production processes again, and we combined three methods in this study: questionnaires, expert judgments, and neuroimaging. You can also see our collaborators on the side: Shungo Suzuki, Hansai Tsui, Shunshui Matsuura, Kazuya Saito, and Motoaki Sugiura. As Vahid mentioned earlier, our focus was on posing behaviors, and you might be wondering why we're focusing on posing. These are silences, right? But we do know actually a lot of speech production and written production processes do occur through posing. When it comes to writing, apparently more than 50% of our writing time is actually taken up by posing. So the question was, do neural processes differ by pose location during oral task performance? Why pose location? But first of all, let me define what we mean by pose location, and I'm also going to share the rationale why it's interesting to look at poses at different locations. Here you can see two poses from our data set. The first of them provides an example for a so-called end close pose. Here the participant said, if I were in the sinking boat, and then they posed, I will choose knife lighter, and there was another pose. So here you can see both of these poses occur at the end of the closes. And here we have another example, which is an example from mid-close pose. Here the participant said, if I were in, and here came the pose, the sinking boat, I will choose knife, and then we had another pose, a knife lighter. Notice here that the poses occurred within the close. Why is this interesting? Why is it interesting to make a distinction between end-close poses and mid-close poses? There's quite a bit of research suggesting from second language acquisition research that when we have trouble, when we have any disruption in our conceptualization processes, we struggle with what we would like to say. This tends to be reflected in end-close posing behaviors. This is something that both first language and second language speakers might do, right? Even if you're first language speaker using, speaking in your first language, but you talk about a different topic, you might show this sort of posing behavior. When it comes to formulation processes, on the other hand, when you struggle with looking for the right vocabulary or the grammar, or you struggle with phonetic encoding processes. We know from second language acquisition research, this tends to be more reflected in mid-close posing behaviors. So based on this, probably you can already guess that when it comes to second language speaking, we tend to show more extensive mid-close posing as compared to end-close posing, and end-close posing behaviors tend to be quite unanimous across first and second language speakers. Right, so this was one thing that we wanted to look at in our study. Do neural processes differ by pose location? All of what we described, we know from behavioral research, from stimulated recall studies, mostly studies looking at pose frequency and pose length, but we had no neural evidence for this difference. We were also interested in language effects. Does it matter when we speak in our first language or second language? And finally, are there any task complexity effects? What is task complexity? Some of you might not be familiar with this term. Task complexity refers to the inherent cognitive demands of tasks. For example, if a task is more complex, if it includes more elements and requires more reasoning, it could be more cognitively demanding as compared to a less complex task, which might include fewer elements or less reasoning. Of course, you can operationalize task complexity in different ways as well, but these are just two examples. So it has to do with inherent cognitive load, and a more complex task would require greater reasoning, more cognitive engagement. So based on this background, our hypothesis was then our participants engaged in end-close posing, most likely they be engaged in conceptualization processes at the cognitive level. And we expected that we would also see that conceptualization brain areas would be activated more. On the other hand, when we observe mid-close posing behaviors, again, the assumption is that this reflects formulation processes. Our assumption and expectation was that this is going to relate to language-related areas in the brain. So we would see greater activation, those areas which have been associated with language use. What about task complexity? Our assumption was if a task is more complex, it requires greater cognitive demands, then probably this is also going to put greater pressure on conceptualization processes. And if that's the case, we would expect greater occurrence of end-close posing and also greater activation in conceptualization-related brain areas. We also assumed if we have to talk about something more complex, it usually also requires more complex linguistic behavior. So maybe that would also lead to greater activation in language-related brain areas, as we have to focus more on formulation as well. So moving on to the study, we had 26 Japanese learners of L2 English. I know it might not seem like a large sample size, but in neuroscience studies, this is actually quite a reasonable population. Normally, these are quite expensive studies, so it's not easy to recruit participants and get the equipment. They were all university students. There were 12 females, 14 males, and the mean age was around 20. And they also did the Oxford listening test course so that we could control for language proficiency. They completed 8 monologic speaking tasks in the fMRI scanner. As you can see, these were all disaster-related decision-making tasks, either a desert island, parachute, earthquake, and so on. You'll get to see an example later. And why they were, here's the example, it comes right away. So in this particular task, participants, this is something that we refer to flooding. They've been told that they have just received the flooding alert. They needed to leave by car. It takes about 3 hours to drive to the emergency accommodation. And they were asked to choose 4 items from the list to take with them. And they also had to explain why they would choose or would not choose these items. If you've ever been a language teacher, you know this is the typical desert island task. And all of these tasks had a similar structure. Half of the tasks were completed by our participants in L2 English and the other half in L1 Japanese. And when it comes to task complexity, we'll only be telling you the results for L2 English. They also completed simple and complex versions. And just to say that all of these were also counterbalanced task complexity and language across the participants. So what about task complexity? How did we operationalize this? Remember, we have the flooding task, and under the simple condition, the choice between these items we thought would be relatively simple. If you look at those items, there is the coffee maker, the bottle of wine, your favorite book. Maybe when you're in emergency, you can leave some of these items behind, and maybe this decision is going to be more straightforward. I would struggle with the coffee maker, but still, it's relatively straightforward. When you go and look at the more complex version, here all the items we thought was quite important and quite essential. So we assumed that maybe making the decision here would require more reasoning and more complex decision making. Indeed, our experts, who were two well-known task complexity researchers, I think I can share, they're happy for me to share who they are, Peter Skian and Roger Gilabert, they agreed that our task complexity manipulation seemed to be correct, seemed to be on the right track, and for all 8 tasks, they confirmed that they seem to be valid from their perspective. All right, as I mentioned earlier, task language and task complexity were counterbalanced across our participants. Once they completed each of these tasks, we also asked them to complete a perception questionnaire. They had to tell us how difficult they felt the task was and how much mental effort they felt it required. What was a little bit disappointing and surprising for us, despite our experts judged the task complexity versions different, our learner data and learner perceptions did not find, they didn't find any difference between the simple and complex task conditions. And remember this is going to be quite interesting when it comes to interpreting our results. Again, our expert judgments did find a difference, but the learner perception data was telling us there was no difference between the simple and complex conditions. Here comes fMRI scanning. We used, Hyeonjeong Jeong and her team used an 3D MRI Philips Achieva machine at Tohoku University. We had an MRI compatible noise cancelling microphone. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see if you don't use this type of microphone, actually it's really difficult to hear what the participants are saying, and it's also difficult for them to hear any instructions. Actually, originally we thought we might be able to transcribe our data automatically, but this is really raw data. If you've ever been in an fMRI scanner, you will know it's quite loud in there. I had the opportunity to try this at Tohoku. It's a memorable experience for sure. Okay, so what happens when someone does functional magnetic resonance imaging? Or basically what fMRI does, it takes pictures of slices of our brain, and the brightness of each of that image tells how much neuroactivity is actually going on in that part of the brain. So neurons are a little bit like muscles. For example, I like to run. Okay, this is one of my things that I tend to do a lot. So when you start running, you start moving your legs, and then clearly more blood needs to go to that part of your body, right? So if you go to the gym and maybe you do a bit of weightlifting, it's going to be your hand that's going to need more blood. And our brain is just like that. Neurons are like muscles. When part of our brain is turned on, neurons start firing there, and more blood needs to be sent to these neurons. And this more blood has some magnetic signature, and this is which is picked up by the fMRI machine. So shortly or in some, fMRI detects small changes in blood flow that occur with brain activity. So the more active our brain is in a particular area, the more blood flow is going to be there, and more likely we are to detect increase. So moving on to our analysis, first we transcribed the 2008 task performances that we collected. We used the speech the speech analysis software Prod. If you're familiar with this, this is the way the platform looks like. So we have different tiers here. The first one shows the sound waves, and then our coding included 3 levels. We first coded, it wasn't really coding, but we identified the task, and then we had the transcription. And in the last tier, this was really important for us, we coded for pause type, whether we had silent or field pauses. A field pause would be something like and so on when you speak. We didn't analyze field pauses in our data set in the end because there were not many instances of field poses and in at least in this Japanese speaker speech. Then we also decided whether these poses occurred in mid-close or end-close positions, and our pose threshold was the traditional 250 milliseconds. Okay, moving on to our statistical analysis. To analyze our behavioral data, we used a series of mixed effects regression analysis. We had random effects, participants, and prompts. And depending on our research questions, our fixed effects were language, task complexity, or location of poses. Moving on the fMRI analysis, Hyeonjeong and her team used standard pre-processing procedures to begin with, conventional within participant and between participant random effects analysis, using the statistical parametric software and MATLAB. And then they also engaged in brain response analysis with standard ANOVA and GLM, and the independent variables were the same as in our R analysis, language, task complexity, and location of poses. So what did we find? First, just a glimpse at the data set. Although we had relatively few participants, altogether there were 5,878 poses in our data set, and this particular figure shows the language effects. The blue columns indicate R2 English, and the orange columns L1 Japanese. As you can see, not surprisingly, there was a greater frequency of mid-close poses in L2 English as compared to L1 Japanese. This is what we expected. Remember, mid-close posing has to do with linguistic encoding processes. And of course, that's more difficult when you speak in your second language. When it comes to end-close poses, again, these are related with conceptualization, what you'd like to say. We don't see any significant, or here, not significance just yet, but if you just look at this figure, there doesn't seem to be a big difference in terms of end-close posing frequency. And indeed, our mixed effects logistic regression model confirmed that language predicted the likelihood whether participants posed mid-close or end-close. Moving on to pose length, here that didn't seem to be a big difference in terms of language, but end-close poses were longer. This is again something that we see in behavioral research as compared to mid-close poses. And we did indeed find a significant effect for pose location, but not for language here. What about task complexity? Again, blue columns indicate mid-close poses and the orange columns end-close poses. And as you can see, if you look at the behavioral data, there doesn't seem to be a difference across the task complexity conditions. Again, something to remember, task complexity did not seem to make a difference when it comes to pose length or pose frequency. We saw similar patterns across simple and complex tasks, with greater number of mid-close poses than end-close poses. And the same sort of patterns were observed for pose length. Here, end-close poses were longer, but no clear task complexity effects. And our mixed effects regression models did indeed confirm that there was no significant difference across task complexity conditions. But moving on to the brain data, this is where things become really exciting, I think. But it was important, just before we move on to the brain analysis, it was really important to do this behavioral analysis just to see whether our results are aligned with what we know from previous behavioral research, and overall they were. So this is a good sign. So what we see, probably we're on the right track. We are observing typical patterns. So in terms of the brain analysis, what we found that when it comes to end-close positions, there was a greater activation in the precuneus. In the middle here, you can see a schematic representation of the brain just to make it easier for you to see what area of the brain was involved. And on the left for me, right, probably is the left for you as well, you can see the actual data from our study. The precuneus is an area which is associated with a theory of mind network and conceptualization of content. So we were actually thinking this makes sense, right? We asked these participants to imagine that in an emergency situation, they have to make a decision, but they were not there themselves. So probably they had to think what somebody would do in a similar situation. And the theory of mind system is indeed concerned with this. It sort of relates to how humans understand others' beliefs, desires, and intentions. So again, it seems logical that this particular network would be involved when participants make decisions in this particular type of situation. When it comes to mid-closed poses as compared to unclosed poses, we also observed that in mid-closed position, there was greater activation in the left inferior frontal gyrus. You could also refer to as partly, or maybe it's more familiar if you hear the term Broca's area. This is an area associated with syntactic processing and retrieval of words. And we also found greater activation in another language-related area, in the basal ganglia, which has been shown to be associated with syntactic processing in previous research. Again, in the middle, you can see the schematic representations, and on the left, you can see the actual data from our study. So what we are seeing here actually is pretty much aligned with what we expected. Remember, we said that mid-closed pose behaviors would be associated with linguistic encoding processes, and when it comes to unclosed posing behaviors, it would be more related to conceptualization-related processes. We also found an interaction effect between language and pose location. Again, this is something that we expected. As you can see, when it comes to second language performance in mid-closed positions, there was greater activation in some areas of the brain. These are the left and right parts of the inferior frontal gyrus, and these areas which have received greater activation in mid-closed position in previous neuroimaging research have been related to sentence construction and vocabulary selection. Again, not surprising. We would expect that second language speakers would probably need to engage in greater activity and more effort when it comes to sentence construction and vocabulary retrieval. So just getting back to our assumption, we're doing quite well, especially when it comes to language effects. Indeed, we did find that when it comes to conceptualization-related brain areas, these tend to be associated with unclosed posing behaviors, and language-related brain areas with mid-closed posing behaviors. But what about task complexity? This is where things become really interesting. Remember, our behavioral data did not find an effect for task complexity, neither the pose behaviors nor the participants' perception data. But the neuroimaging data actually did yield a task complexity effect. We did find that when it comes to unclosed poses, there was greater activation in the precuneus under complex task conditions as compared to simple task conditions. Also, there was greater activation in the left angular gyrus. Again, the precuneus is a theory of mind related area. Again, this makes sense. If a task is more complex, you need to do more thinking, more conceptualization is involved. Probably this area might play a role. We also found that during complex task performance, there was greater activation in the bilateral precentral gyrus, which is a premotor area associated with language activation. Again, another piece of evidence that maybe task complexity did actually make a difference. So again, we did find some confirmation from the neuroimaging data for task complexity effects. The only difference was that we did not find a pose location effect. Further research, maybe we can figure out later what might have been the underlying reason for this. Okay, so let me just move on to my next slide. And I think this is really important to bring all of this together. I mentioned earlier how important it is to triangulate sources. And I think our study provides a really good example for this. Remember, we had the expert judgments who did confirm that probably there would be a task complexity effect. The perception data from the students, the participants, yielded no task complexity effect. But in the neuroimaging data, a task complexity effect actually did emerge. And just to say, we also found no task complexity effects on pose frequency or pose length. So what could be the reason for this? Maybe the neural data was more sensitive than our behavioral measures in this particular study to pick up task complexity effects. Again, these are relatively small sample size. We need more research. But again, a takeaway message is it's important, it's helpful to triangulate sources. And even when it comes to neuroimaging, it's expensive, right? So often behavioral researchers might say, why do all those expensive studies? Because we actually can get the data through behavioral means. And I think our study is a good example that maybe neuroimaging data might add something that the behavioral measures cannot really tap. So we were really, excited about this finding when it came to task complexity effects. All right, so moving on from speaking to writing. Here, this is a study that we've conducted and it's under review, finger crossed. You can see our collaborators here as well. We have Hyeonjeong Liu from Tohoku University, Sin Rong and Ting Zheng from UCL, who were the RAs here, and Motoaki Sugiura is our collaborator again. This time, it's a very similar study, but we're looking at writing. And we are triangulating free sources again, questionnaires, neuroimaging data, and keystroke logging this time. And we're interested in posing behaviors and related neurocognitive processes. Do these differ by pose location when it comes to writing? This is one type of output that you get from a keystroke logging software. I'm not sure whether you've used this type of software before. What it does, it shows what somebody has written, so you can see the actual keystrokes. It also shows when somebody paused. Here, for example, we had a pause of 7,348 milliseconds between the word's history and end. And what we did and you can also see here that it also captures the functions keys. Here there was a lot of back, so basically this participant has deleted almost everything they've written. This data does not come from our study though, but now you have an idea what type of data you can get from keystroke logging. In our study, we had a custom-made keystroke logging software to make sure that this would be synchronized with the fMRI scanner, which was developed at Tohoku University. What about pose locations in writing? Here we have a few examples for you. When it comes to writing, we make a distinction between within word pauses. Here you can see a pause of 2,652 milliseconds within the word importance. Here we have an example for a pause between two words, then and ever. And finally, an example for a between sentence pause. You can see the word ever. Here we have two pauses, but when it comes to keystroke logging, usually these are combined. And followed by the new sentence, there's a capital lock, which is pressed, and then comes the determiner, the. So we were looking at within word pausing behavior, between words pauses, and between sentence pauses in our study. Our hypotheses were, again, very similar to our hypothesis in speaking. When participants pause between sentences, these are larger units, we expected greater activation in conceptualization-related brain areas. And when it comes to pausing within words and between words, these are lower texture units. Probably there would be greater activation in language-related brain areas. And I'm going to hand over to Hyeonjeong, who is going to explain the study.
Okay, I will explain about the method part for the writing study. Our participants, we recruited 21 Japanese learner of English. They are all the university students, undergraduate and graduate student. And there are 5 female and 16 females. Their age is 22, and also we access their language proficiency level using Oxford listening test score, and it turned out their levels in terms of the FR B1 to C1 levels. Okay, data collections. We already, Andrea explained the task, the details. We also use the part of the task. We choose the 4 writing task, the disaster-related decision task. So just using same task, but they have to write what they are consider about when they understand the task. So here is the 4 task, and then maybe we can go to the next. This task is same. Okay, this one is the already explained, so same as fruiting, but almost the same task, but they have to write what they want to decide to choose the items. And then task procedure is because this is writing it took more time. So 1 minute planning time, the participants have a 1 minute planning time, and then for 10 minutes, they wrote what they choose the items. And then we record their behavior writing. fMRI scanning, same as the 3 Tesla MRI. And also you can see this is how we conduct experiment. Okay. And then we used this time is specialized MRI comparable keyboard. This is, I believe that this is first the full of the writing the task first time. Yeah, so we really exciting. And then maybe we can go the next. Okay, data analysis. So we acquired their behavior data using keyboard and also using keyboard already explained keystroke longings using some software. And then we determined their poses using based on the threshold 200 milliseconds. If more than 200 milliseconds, we identify these are poses and classifying those longer than 200 milliseconds as poses. Then, based on their position, we categorize the three types of the poses within words that's occurred, the pose occurred within the words, and the pose occurred between words, and pose occurred between sentences. So this time we identified three types of poses. Then brain activation patterns were also identified for poses detected in the keystroke logs based on the behavior analysis. Then to analyze the behavioral data, we ran the series of the mixed effect regression analysis, and our random effect were participant and prompt, and also fixed effect were task complexity and the location of poses. This time is we only used English L2, and also the task is a simple and complex task. And then fMRI for fMRI data analysis, same as standard pre-processing procedure, conventional within participants and with participants random effect analysis were performed using SPM. This is just follow the standard analysis using SPM 12 software. And this time, we focusing on poses. Brain responses were analyzed with repeated measures, ANOVA and the GLM. In particular, we focused on the location of poses as independent variables. There were three levels of location poses already explained: within words, between words, and between sentences. Then, okay, let's move on the result. Consider the finding of the, okay, this one, let's look at the result of pose frequency first. Although our sample size is 21, relatively relatively small, but based on the number of poses, we identified 30,161 poses in the data set in total. So it's really huge. So we can analyze data and also try to look at the brain activation based on this data. So in this figure, the column represents the number of poses occurring between sentences, between words, and within the words during English writing. As shown, the highest number of poses occurred within the words, and followed by between words, then between sentences. We interpret this distribution as reflecting natural differences in typing during writing. And then let's look at the pose lengths. Okay, we found poses between sentences were significantly longer than those between words and within words. So mixed effect regression model confirmed that these differences was statistically significant. But this is also followed based on the writing cognitive processing, reflect very natural writing processes. Okay, let's look at the brain data. I think you already attended the speaking cognitive processing of the speaking. The result is quite similar, surprisingly. So when we compared between sentence, then between words, we found the brain activation in precuneus. Andrea already explained these areas associated theory of mind and related to the conceptualization processing. So we found this area more activated between sentences, even during the writing. You can see the graph. Okay, so here, this one, the between sentences show the greater activation than other two conditions. Okay, let's move on to the next. We compared this time when we compare to other two poses between words conditions. Between words poses showed significant activation in left inferior frontal gyrus. We really, when we found this, the result, we really surprised. This is really completely correspond to the speaking data. So you can also see here activation patterns. The blue color between words showed greater activation in this left inferior frontal gyrus. Greater activation for these conditions. This area is relevant to syntactic processing or linguistic analysis processing. So this is also quite reasonable cognitive processing. Okay, let's look at the activation patterns. When we compare the within word poses compared to the between sentence, between word poses, we found the several brain areas more activated for the within word poses. That is the motor area that is related more like typing, superior parietal lobule that is related to spatial perception and also phonological working memory. And the last one is left inferior occipital gyrus that relevant to the lateral recognition. So again, this activation is really reasonable result in the context of a written task, as it likely reflects the demand of typing and knowledge of the L2 spelling. Okay, and then Andrea will summarize.
Thank you, Hyeonjeong. So again, when it comes to our results, the summary, as Hyeonjeong already mentioned, we did find what we expected to see. We did see that when it comes to pausing between sentences, it was the conceptualization-related brain areas which received greater activation. And when it came to pausing within words, between words, these are lower texture units, it was the language-related areas that remained received greater brain activation. And what is interesting here, we saw these patterns in behavioral research before. We saw that through stimulated recall, also pause length, pause frequency. But this is the first time that we actually confirm these results through neurocognitive mechanisms as well, focusing on neuroimaging. So it's really nice when these findings and these patterns converge. And what is really exciting that Hyeonjeong also referred to earlier, at least I find this quite fascinating. Remember, we started talking about spoken and written production processes, and we introduced these two models, which, they had quite similar stages. When it comes to speaking and writing, as we mentioned, we first need to think about what we're going to say or write. And we did find that indeed, when it comes to enclosed pauses or between sentence pauses, similar things, we often see greater activation in the precuneus in both modalities. And the reason why this is interesting, because when it comes to research, there are the people who work on written production, there are the scholars who work on oral production. The models are quite similar, but very few cases these two strands come together and actually there might be, they might be looking at differences in outcomes of production, but not really at the neurocognitive processes. And clearly there are, important similarities, which is not surprising, but still something that hasn't been shown before. And we did find a greater activation in the theory of mind area, as we mentioned earlier. When it comes to formulation processes or translation processes, again, these are quite similar mechanisms in speaking and writing. We just use different terminology. And in both modalities, in speaking and writing, we did find higher activation in the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is a language-related area. When it came to pausing between words, within clauses, remember these are the areas which has been assumed to be associated with linguistic encoding processes based on previous behavioral research. But again, we are the first to show this, that indeed this relates to neural mechanisms as well. So again, this has important implications for theory building and also for methodology, we believe. Okay, but of course, these studies do have important limitations. They're clearly low in ecological validity. Again, if you've been in an fMRI machine, speaking or writing in an fMRI, it's not natural. It's definitely not how we feel in real life. Also, we did start talking about emergency situations, the decision-making task we had, real language learning tasks, right? So in our future research, and this is something that we would love to do, we would like to simulate more real emergency settings and see what happens in those situations. Also, although we think we are, doing cutting edge research here, bringing together different methods, we could do even better. We didn't have verbal protocol data, no eye tracking data. And when it comes to writing, reading is a really important process, and eye tracking can help us, gain insight into reading processes. Also, we have no information this time about participants' conscious processes, and stimulated recall would allow us to gain insights into, the conscious processing that our participants engage in while they write. So in our future research, we want to do better, and we would like to bring all of these data sources together. We're actually collecting data in November at Tohoku, and hopefully we get to bring together all of these data sources, neuroimaging, stimulated recall, eye tracking, and keystroke logging. And we're really excited about triangulating these various sources and see whether we see similar patterns. Unfortunately, for now, this is not going to be in the same machine. We'll have participants who write in the fMRI machine, and then they also do the same type of tasks while writing on a laptop, while we track their eye movements. But maybe in the future, this is my dream study, we have the eye tracking also built into the fMRI machine. This is possible. So maybe Hyeonjeong manages to convince her team to invest in this technology and then be able to do this in the future as well. So getting back to just where we started with, what are some implications for research to begin with? The neuro evidence, again, helped us confirm assumptions derived from cognitive behavioral research. As I mentioned earlier, there was quite a large body of research looking at posing behaviors, fluency studies from a behavioral perspective, but we were the first to see whether the patterns that they were observed would also come up through neuroimaging, and again we did find that was the case. Similar neurocognitive processes were involved in speaking and writing. Again, this is something new that hasn't really been done before. The theory of mind area was involved when L1 and L2 learners made decisions and planned their speech and writing, and language-related areas were called upon when participants formulated their speech or written production. And again, I know I keep emphasizing this, but I think this is one of the key messages of this talk is that the neuro evidence appear to yield insights that we will not have been able to get only using behavioral measures. So this type of triangulation seems important. Finally, implications for crisis situations. We do know not that many, but anyway, we do know that our tasks were not really crisis situation tasks in terms of, requiring huge mental effort. But one thing seems important, and also from a task-based language teaching perspective, one of my other areas of research, if we would like to alleviate cognitive load in crisis situations, these participants need to practice conceptualization because it can lead to increased activity. And also, of course, when it comes to second language speakers, they also need to practice the relevant language. So when they are in this type of situations, they probably be able to act and use the language they have available in those crisis settings as well. And I think we're going to stop here. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Hyeonjeong. I really enjoyed listening to you. You have done a lot. You have achieved a lot. And I'm sure that everyone listening to you has really enjoyed the talk that you presented. May I suggest that you stop sharing the slides so as we start having a conversation after your talk, we can also see your faces and communicate better. All right, so I have already written in the chat box that if anyone in the audience has any questions, please make sure to type your questions in the chat box, send it to us, and I'll make sure to read it out here. But I do have some questions, and out of excitement and interest, and also some points that I wanted to share, and I would like to see what you think about them. Do you mind if I start asking questions, and I'll be very happy to ask the questions that the audience puts in the chat box. you have looked at the task complexity. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit for us, Andrea or Hyeonjeong, or both of you. You mentioned about more elements in the task, more elements in task would indicate task complexity. It would be great if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, on what elements here you were referring to, and if someone wants to replicate your study, what would you recommend to them to do?
Okay, I mean, maybe that's for me. I'm, I'm the one who's done more research on task complexity. When I mentioned more elements, this was just an example to define what task complexity might mean. In our study, we did not manipulate the number of elements, but that could be another way to manipulate task complexity. In our study, the assumption was that participants, when the decision among the various items is more difficult, they that would require more reasoning, and that would be the task complexity factor in our case, more or less reasoning. And the assumption was it would lead to greater cognitive effort.
Okay,
Is
wonderful.
that
Thanks.
okay? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. By the way, we just received a question here, but thanks for your answer, Andrea. And I'm gonna read it out. It's from Joe, who says, "Thank you very much for the wonderful study. Just curious about whether participants' typing skills would affect their pausing behaviors in the writing tasks, especially in the fMRI experimental condition."
Hyeonjeong, would you like to go for this?
Uh, I think that because the fMRI, they cannot see with their keyboard, so we have to recruit the people who can't blind type. So using the screening test, we recruited the people who really had to acquire the good writing skill. So, but I can say their typing skill, in particular in English, is highly correlated with their proficiency level. But do we check their posing type of posing or number of posing and with their some proficiency level, Andrea?
I think we did look into that, but this was more of a within subject design in that sense. So it wasn't really important, but it's a very, I mean, in terms of the questions you were answering, but that's a really good question. And indeed, Hyeonjeong and I actually were just talking about this the other day when we were planning the new study. And we were also reflecting on it also depends on the writing system, right? So if you were, let's say, my first language is Hungarian, but you, let's say, type in L2 English, typing is not so different. But when it comes to Japanese and, typing in L1 English, it brings in, so proficiency, not surprisingly, probably does make a difference. But thank you for the question. That's something that we can look into. But typing skill is indeed, we hope we manage to get participants again who can do blind typing.
Very nice. And thank you. Well, we have a tripartite question here. Yuchin is asking, I'm going to read them quickly to you. One is, how did you differentiate the language effects, that's language itself, from participants' language proficiency effects? So maybe we can answer one at a time, then I'll read the second one and so on.
Maybe I can go for this one.
Okay.
Again, good question. We just compared L1 Japanese and L2 English in this case. But indeed, proficiency could be an interesting variable. Our sample size is relatively small to do this type of analysis. But again, maybe we should also say this is all preliminary research. This is the first time we are doing this type of thing. So, but yes, we do see that indeed there could be a difference. But the participants, they were clearly their proficiency was these were not C2 learners in their L2, so probably the L1 L2 difference was justified.
Okay. Thanks. And there is a second question as
Yeah,
well regarding
maybe
the brain
Oh,
regions. Sorry.
you'd like to say something?
maybe I can answer this second question, whether we analyze the whole brain analysis or just look at the target of the certain brain area. Actually, we did whole brain analysis, and then we found the precuneus and left inferior frontal gyrus. So even the small sample size, but the participant produced many poses, and then we could differentiate different type of the poses using whole brain analysis.
Okay, very nice. So correct me if I'm wrong, Hyunjong, you're an expert in fMRI research. In fNIRS, that's a device that we're using here. We always need to compare the condition that is of interest with another condition, a kind of reference point or something like that. And that's what you have also done in the fMRI study, right? It's like a comparative, relative
Yes,
sort
yes.
of differentiation rather than an absolute pattern
That's
that
why
everybody.
there is when we look at the fMRI data, there is no absolute the brain activation. Always, that's why we make a design and put some control condition or comparison conditions. So this
Awesome.
time we have a different type of the poses. It's quite easy to compare between poses, and also
Very
L1 and L2.
okay. Andrea, do you have anything else to add to answer the second question, or would you like me to move to
No,
the
no, no,
third
I'm
one?
so glad that Hyeonjeong is here. But maybe I can do number three.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
It was about 200 millisecond post threshold. Indeed, we apply this post threshold to both field and silent poses. We're just following traditions in fluency research. As I mentioned, there were not many fillers, but not based on this study. But I often get this question when we talk about this research. I think it probably has to do with Japanese as a second Japanese Alma speaker speaking. Japanese RT. Long time ago, I collected data from Japanese Alban speakers and Spanish Alban speakers using L2 English. And when comparing these two types of data sets, in the L2 Spanish data, there were a lot of field poses. So in our case, the only reason why we didn't, it's probably an L1 effect. We didn't look at the field poses because the sample, we didn't have enough to do the analysis. You're also wondering whether the annotation is done using scripts or manual checking. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, since the ephemeralities, the transcription was so loud. The original plan was to do automatic transcription, but it was not possible. It was really hard to hear, and actually, some of the participants we had to exclude because of that. And we should also mention Shungo Suzuki here, who is a well-known fluency researcher. He did most of the transcriptions and the menu analysis, so we're very grateful to him for all the work. So we didn't use scripts; it's all manual analysis, and I was the second coder, so hopefully the reliability was also checked.
Yeah, okay, very, very nice. So we can, oh, actually, we have another question here from Daniel
Thank you
Yusheng
so much
Chang.
for these questions and interest. Oh, Daniel, I
Yeah.
know you.
Okay, I can read it out quickly. Thank you so much for this presentation. It seems that sample size is one important consideration in the study like this. I am wondering, for the research design using fMRI in language studies, are there any recommendations for sample size? Thank you so much for sharing.
Well,
This is for
this
you,
is,
Hyeonjeong.
yes, this question is very important. Yeah, I admit our sample size is small, even in the field of the fMRI. But still, we have more than 20 participants, so we can analyze that. And then, thankfully, after statistical analysis, we get a significant result that follow the whole statistical threshold. But generally, of course, if we get the more participants that give a more better or clear the result, but 30, 40 participants, it's really depending on the effect size. When we try to look at the very tiny differences, in particular second language learners, we need more participants. And also, if we are interested in individual differences, usually we recruited 50, more than 50 participants. But if we look at the L1 data, it's most of the participants showed quite a similar cognitive processing. Maybe within the 20 participants, we get a strong effect. So I cannot say how many participants is good, but basically in this field, it's cost also a lot. So 30 or 40 participants is kind of a general standard sample size, I guess.
Very nice. Pretty much similar to the sample size that you would need for a simple, basic, but still rigorous parametric data analysis in which you want to generalize to a population. Okay. So I also have another question. I have taken quite a lot of notes. I'm not sure how good I am at note taking. I may have missed quite a lot of important points here. So my next question, it's basically out of my own curiosity, is about the research questions, and it would be nice if you could elaborate on this a little bit. The effect of task complexity on pause, frequency, and length. That's, I guess, the first research question in the paper published in second language acquisition, studies in second language acquisition. The effect of task complexity on pause frequency and length. And the second question was the effect of task complexity on neural processes during pausing. Um, since we are doing a similar analysis in which we have, again, parallel research questions like that, where the independent variable is affecting dependent variables in the analysis. And so the argument here is whether to separate these two as two separate research questions or put everything into one comprehensive model. I was wondering what you think about that.
What would be the model? I'm just, are you thinking in terms of a statistical model?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we haven't considered that. What I wonder, wouldn't it be a sample? No, it's some because it would be a multivariate model then, right? We would have two dependent variables, and you're the stats expert, guru. So I wonder whether our sample size would allow for that, would it? Or what do you have in mind? We're also learning here.
Mm.
Well, I'm just exploring really here. I wanted to have your take on it. And so I understand that there are two schools of thoughts. One is that you can separate them and you put them into separate models. I think that's what the approach that you have taken. And another school of thought is you can put everything into one model and figure out whether the the even the independent variables have some connection with each other. So if they have any confounding effects, for example, or some sort of, if you could discover some mediation moderation sort of relationship
Mhm.
between the
Oh, I
network
see what
of
you mean.
variables. Mm,
Yeah, we haven't done that, but that's something that would be interesting to do in the future.
mm.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Um, so we have around a minute, actually, where we have scheduled the talk for about 1 hour. We're around 10 minutes or so above the time that we have scheduled. But if you don't mind, I just want to ask one last question if you don't have any questions from the audience here. Um, in terms of, since I'm based at a school, I mean, a teacher training language institute here, I was wondering, in terms of the contribution of your great work to teaching and the implications for teachers, if you could also say a little bit, how would teachers use the results of your research and the findings that you have presented so far?
I guess that's for me, right, Hyeonjeong? So
I think so.
yeah, so I often, again, this is a question I'm involved in teacher education, and again, I think this is whatever I do, I hope that along, somewhere down the lane, it's going to have some sort of implications for teaching. But I think when we want to draw implications for teaching, first we really need to understand what actually happens when language learners engage in tasks or learning processes. So if we don't understand these underlying mechanisms, we might not draw the valid or the useful implications for teaching. But this type of work that Hyeonjeong and her team and us are doing, this is more basic type of research. So it's a bit tricky to draw, implications for teaching based on an fMRI study when you're writing like that, or it's not a natural type of setting. But I think it's important to do this type of basic research, and then we can move on to more practical applications and more classroom-based research. I also do quite a bit of that, especially with my PhD students. But I think both lines of work are extremely important. But again, based on this particular study, I think it would be a bit far-fetched to draw any pedagogical implications. What do you think, Hyeonjeong?
I think so. But it's the Andrea is based on if we understand the cognitive processing, maybe it's much easier to the connect to the education, the pedagogical implications. So it's maybe this is kind of the start point to understand how L2 learners process writing and speaking.
Wonderful. Thank you. My own research is increasingly at the intersection between more basic research, as you said, and more pedagogy based. And I think when I look at my research nowadays, I'm moving increasingly more towards the basic and fundamental sort of research. So I always encounter this question. They ask me, what is the implication of your research for classroom teaching or for classroom-based assessment and things like that? Most often I find myself thinking, well, when I was developing this research proposal or applying for this research grant, actually that was not something that I was considering because the aim is different. The aim is discovery and understanding rather than having an immediate implication for classroom-based
But I think it's
pedagogy and teaching.
important, just as you're saying, because if you don't understand the underlying processes, then we are drawing implications based on, our impressions and not necessarily solid evidence. So I'm with you on that.
Very good. Thank
Anyway.
you. Good, thank you. I'll record your answer to this particular question whenever they ask me, and just I will just play it for them. Say two gurus in the field have agreed with me on this point. Okay, thank you again, Andrea and Hyeonjeong. If you have any final words that you would like to share with us, anything that you think you would like us to know about your research or future research, would be great before we call it a day.
Maybe just one thing. I think it's really important to collaborate with people like Hyeonjeong. This is the first time I don't understand every single aspect of the research we're doing, and I couldn't have imagined this a few years ago. But it's really amazing to bring this type of expertise together. So yeah.
Exactly. And Hyeonjeong, would you
Right.
also do you have any
Thank you
final
for
remarks?
giving me this great opportunity to share our research with you. And also, I also agree with Andrea's opinion. Through the collaboration, I really learn a lot, and also this kind of collaborative work is more necessary to understand the second language acquisition. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank
Indeed.
Thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure to host both of you, and thank you everyone for staying with us. This was Interface 5, Neurocognitive Correlates of Task-Based Production, Exploring Pausing Behaviors in Second Language Speaking and Writing. The wonderful studies that were presented were presented by Professors Hyeonjeong Jeong and Andrea Révész. And this brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you again and have a great day.